Hilchos Maaser Perek Shlishi, the laws of the Maaser separation, the 10% to the Levite, chapter 3. Yesterday we introduced the concept of Oynas HaMaasres. Oynas HaMaasres basically means that every single produce, grain or fruit, has a point of its growth at which it becomes obligated to be tithed. At this point, if it reaches that stage and you would harvest it right now, you would have to tithe it. Take the Truma, take the Maaser, as the law is. However, as we're going to learn in today's chapter, just because produce reached that point of growth doesn't mean in this current situation you're going to have to tithe it. We need another thing which is called kvius lemaiser. Kvius lemaiser means entering the stage at which the produce has to be tithed before it's eaten. Kvius literally means becoming set, establishing a permanence. There are different circumstances that if the produce meets those circumstances, now it definitely has to be tithed before it's eaten. But before the produce reaches these circumstances, even if in terms of growth it has reached Oynas HaMaasres, they're not going to be obligated to be tithed, as we're going to discuss at length in this chapter. Says the Rambam, Halacha Aleph, Peiris shehigiu la'Oynas HaMaasres, if you have produce which reached the time of Maaser, in other words, in terms of growth, they've achieved that amount of growth which would obligate them to be tithed. V'nislishu, and they were detached from the ground. Va'adayin le'nigmir malachton. However, you didn't yet conclude all the work associated with processing that produce. Going tvua shekotzra v'dasha. Let's say you have grain which was harvested and it was even threshed. Va'adayin le'zara oisa, but you haven't yet winnowed it to separate the chaff from the kernels. V'lei mercha, nor have you put it into a pile. So, muter lecha mehen achilas arai, ad shetigamer melachton. So says the Torah, at this point, you're allowed to eat from this produce in a temporary way. Can't go having a meal and start feasting on it. But as a snack, you can have this produce, ad shetigamer melachton, until the processing work is completed. Umisha tigamer melachton, once the processing work is completed, asur lecha mehen arai, now it's what's called nikba. It's established for Maaser, and it can no longer be eaten, even as a snack, until you tithe it. Says the Rambam, when do we say that the defining line is completing the work process? If you are processing your produce in order to sell them in the market. But if your intent was to take the food home and eat it with your family, then you have even more leeway. Even after you finish all the work associated with the processing the produce, you can continue to eat the fruit as a snack until they enter the state of permanence or establishment. At this point, you're obligated to separate the tithes. And we're going to see that there's 6 circumstances that can cause a person to have his produce obligated in tithes, but just a quick explanation from the Talmud as to why there's a difference between selling and taking it home. Talmud explains because when you sell produce, you've already taken your mind off it. As far as you're concerned, the first buyer you're going to meet, you're going to sell it to him, even if you don't reach the marketplace yet. So in a certain way, as far as you're concerned, the moment you finish the processing work, it's ready to be sold. And food has to be tithed before it's sold, as we learned yesterday rabbinically. So therefore, the moment you complete the work is the moment you have to tithe them. However, when you're taking it home, it's all about your intent. You're taking it to eat with your family. So whenever you're going to plan to eat dinner with it, that's when it'll have to be tithed. So long as it hasn't become established in a permanent way, you can continue to eat the snacks. It says that Rambam Halacha Gimel Echad Mishisha Dvarim Kaiveya HaPeiris LeMaasres. One of 6 things can cause fruit to become established in its obligation to be tithed. Number 1, I didn't put on this slide, is hechatzer, bringing it into the courtyard. Now we remember from the laws of Shabbat that in olden times the way homes were set up was that there would be the public thoroughfare on either side. The public thoroughfare would enter into what's called a mavoi. A mavoi is like a lane or an open area. From the mavoi, they would open into courtyards, what's called the chatzer. And the chatzer would open into homes. So the moment you bring your fruit, as Rambam will soon define exactly the parameters of this, but the moment you bring the fruit into your chatzer, into your courtyard, that's it. It's become nikba lemaiser. It's become set and established, permanent, in the sense that it has to be tithed. That's number 1. The other 5 are on the slide before. The hamekach, sale, we mentioned that before. The ha'esh, fire, treating the produce with fire, as the Rambam will define. The hamelach, and salting, which really means pickling. The hatruma, and taking truma from it. Again, all this will be defined. The hashabbos, and if Shabbos enters. If Shabbos enters, once the produce has been fully processed, it now needs to be tithed. But all these five, again, have to first meet the prerequisite of having all the processing work completed. So in other words, if we can summarize everything we're saying till now, in order for a fruit or a grain to be obligated in tithes, a couple of things have to happen. First of all, it has to reach Einas HaMaasros. That means in terms of its own growth, it has to have grown enough to obligate it in tithes. Even then, if you just harvested it, it's not obligated in tithes till you complete all the work associated with it. At that point, if you're going to the marketplace, you have to tithe it. If not, one of these 6 circumstances have to be met in order for it to be obligated in tithes. And now the Rambam goes through each one and defines them. Ketzad, what does this mean? If you have produce which your intent is to take them home, even though all the work in processing them was completed. You can keep eating snacks from them until they actually enter the home. The moment they enter the home, they have been established in terms of their obligation to be tithed. You cannot eat from them until you tithe them. Same thing if you sold them. Or toasted them under fire. Or salted them, or pickled them with a salty brine. Or you separated the first truma, the 2% to the Kohen. Or Shabbos entered on them. So you cannot eat the fruit or the grain until you take Maaser from them. In these cases, even if they didn't reach the house. In other words, every condition here is mutually exclusive. You don't have to have all 6. Either it comes into the house, or Shabbos comes in, or it's pickled, etc. If you brought them into the house before completing all the processing work, you can still eat from them as a snack. Because again, it's not these circumstances themselves, but they have to come after all the processing work was completed. If the opposite, you brought it into the house and then you began the final stages of the processing, now you need to take Maaser from everything. Notice that Rambam just said you had to have started finishing the work. Started finishing the work means even if you didn't do it to all the produce yet, as the Rambam now defines. Ketzad, what does this mean? If a person were to bring in kishuin udluin, and we keep on going back to this kishuin, this is the cucumis mellow, this one over here. Dluin is the calabash gourd, the bottle gourd type of squash. Before you rub them down. What does that mean? If you see here, I'm not sure how clear it is in the picture, but there's a little bit of fuzz growing around this kishu. And part of the completion of the process was that you would rub down the hairs from this vegetable. Same thing is true of these gourds, these squash. They have a little bit of a layer of fuzz that needs to be rubbed down. So if you brought them into the house, but you didn't rub them down yet, the moment you rub down one of them, since you've revealed your intent that you're doing the final stage of processing at this point, and it's already in the house, it has to be tithed. And the same thing applies in all similar situations. And same thing if you were to take truma from produce, which hasn't had their full processing completed, it's still permitted to eat as a snack from them because the work hasn't been completed, even though one of the conditions of kviyus l'maiser has been met. Except for a basket of figs. A special law when it comes to figs, that if you took truma from the basket of figs before completing its processing work, it's still established for tithes and has to be tithed before you eat more. A person brings home literal fig branches upon which figs are growing. Or date branches upon which dates are growing. If just children or workers brought them into the home, the entrance into the home in this way doesn't establish their obligation of tithes. But if the owner of the home brought them in as such, we can assume that was his intent. He's bringing them home. That's their finished state for him. and therefore he has to take Maaser from them before he eats them. If a person brings stalks into his home, wheat stalks into his home, to make a dough, they haven't been established for Maaser. But if the plan is to eat them as melilois, melilois basically means you take with your hands, pick apart the chaff from the kernel, and you're just going to eat them as kind of raw grain. So then, nikba'u lemaiser, since you brought them in, and for you basically at this point it's finished because your plan is to only eat them as kernels, so then they have been established and they have to take Maaser from them before you eat more. When are we talking about? Grain. But legumes, just doing this to legumes, here's a person doing that to beans, just bringing them in with the intent to eat them by hand doesn't make them established in terms of their Maaser obligation. Halacha vav, mutar laharim al hatvua. It's permitted to make a little trick with grain. Lahachnisa bamoitz, in which you bring it in to your home while it's still in the chaff, with the intent that your animal will eat this grain, and thereby it'll be exempt from Maaser. And then, once you take it into your home with this facetious intent, or so to speak, tricky intent, I'm taking it in from my animals, but now that you have this stuff in your home, winnow little by little after you bring it into your home, and you'll always be exempt from giving any separations to the Kohen or Maaser to the Levi, because at no point will you ever begin to complete everything. You're just taking a little bit, winnowing it, taking a little bit, winnowing it, and the rest in your house, you're saying it's just for my animal. If a person goes over to a friend's produce and does all the work to complete their processing without his intent, or without his consent, without his knowledge. Or if a person goes over to his friend's produce and establishes their obligation for tithes by subjecting them to one of the 6 things which is usually koiveya, usually establishes the obligation of tithes for a produce, but he does this without his friend's consent or awareness, it's too bad on the friend. They have become tevel, they have become untithed insofar as Maaser is concerned, and they cannot be consumed until Maaser is taken. What is the time at which the processing of different produce is complete? So the Rambam goes back to what we already mentioned, give some examples, and give some more examples. Hakishuyin v'hadluyin, the cucumis mellow, and the calabash squash, and watermelons, when he rubs them down by hand and removes the yellowish fuzz on them, which is like a thin hair. You can see it clearly in this picture, not so clearly in the others, but watermelons and the calabash squash also have that kind of a fuzz, has to be rubbed down. That's the concluding stage of its processing. If you're, for whatever reason, not removing the fuzz from these vegetables, you want to sell them as they are, so then the final stage of their processing is when you make them into a pile of watermelons, pile of calabash. Now you've declared, so to speak, the processing is over, and that's the point at which if you're taking them to the market, they have to be tithed, or if not, they have to be subjected to one of the other things that makes them nikbal maaser. When it comes to the watermelon, same thing. You set them up in the backyard, watermelon next to watermelon. If you're rubbing down one by one, once you finish rubbing all the ones that you need, that's the point at which the processing is considered completed. Now, right away we remember that a couple of halachas back, the Rambam said just rubbing down one makes the entire quantity obligated to be tithed. So the commentaries note this contradiction, and they give two answers. One of them is, in the other halacha, the Rambam used the term, he began to conclude the work. In other words, he's rubbing down one just because it's the beginning of them all. Here, he's rubbing down one by one, that's all he needs. Or 2 or 5. The point is he's doing it in a limited quantity. And therefore, only that limited quantity becomes established for tithing, not the others. Another resolution that's offered is that we're talking about 2 different cases. The one in halacha 4 is talking about when a person's doing it at home. Here we're talking about when he's doing it in the field. So there's different halachas. You take truma from the cucumis mellow. That's here. And the calabash squash, And even though you haven't yet taken the fuzz off of it, truma you can take. Not Maaser, but you can take truma. That's the simple meaning of this Rambam. The Radvaz, however, says that even though the Rambam says termin, it also means Maaser, and you can take truma and Maaser after the fact from these squash, even if you haven't yet removed the hair. Halacha tes hayarok hanegat. Vegetables that are sold in bunches, or that are typically bunched up in storage, misha yegoit. Their final stage of processing is when you put them into bunches. If not, then when you fill up a vessel of them, a box. If you're not planning to fill up a box of them, you can eat snacks from these vegetables until you pick whatever it is that you need, and then once you're done picking, then that's for you the end of the processing. Halacha Yud, kalkala, a basket of produce, couldn't find a good picture of this online, made my own one up. But people would gather big baskets of fruit, big baskets of grain, and they would cover it for storage purposes with big leaves or palm branches. So when you cover it, now that's it, you've concluded the processing. If you're not planning on covering the basket, the moment the vessel is filled up, it's considered concluded. Again, if you're not planning to fill up a box of them or a basket of them, then the moment you picked whatever it is that you need, that's the moment that the processing is concluded. Halacha Yud Aleph, Kli Gadol, Shadaita Lemalois Es Chetzir. If you have a big box, but you're only planning to fill up half of it, so even though in the last two halachas we said that you have to fill up the box completely, over here, since your intent to begin with is only to fill up half a box, Kevan Shamile Chetzir Nitbal. The moment you fill up half the box, it becomes tevel, untied, and has to be tied before you go any further. Haya B'daita Lemalos Es Kuloi. But if your intent was to fill up the entire box, entire utensil, Eine Nitbalat Sheyamale Es Kuloi, then indeed, the grain or the produce is not considered to be tevel and doesn't have to be tithed till you fill up the entire box. Hayu shnayim. If there was two boxes, and you're planning not to pick a ton and to fill them both up, that's your intention. So the produce only becomes tevel till you fill them both up. If you bunched vegetables into a huge bunch in the field, even though when you transfer them to the marketplace, you're going to want to kind of split them up into smaller bunches. Nevertheless, since in the field you made a bunch, a big bunch, doesn't matter, it becomes tevel and you have to tie them. Hapered v'hatzimukin v'hecharuvin. Pered means dried pomegranates. Some say dried pomegranate seeds. Some say it just means dried pomegranates. Tzimukin is raisins. Charuvin is carobs. The moment you make a pile out of these things on top of your roof to let them dry, they become established for tithes. And onions, once you remove the leaves and the peels, which you usually remove, that's considered the end of the processing. If not, you're not planning to remove those leaves, then when you make a pile out of them, that's the concluding stage of their processing. All grain follows meruach. Meruach is a very important word. It's going to come up again and again, and it means making a neat, nice pile out of the grain seeds. What is called mimareach? Smoothing down is the literal translation. What is called mimareach in Jewish law? It's when a person nicely shapes the top of a grain pile, birachas with a pitchfork, besoif kol davar at the end of the entire process, like everybody does when you conclude all the processing work, you make it into a beautiful, nice pile. That's the point at which the grain's work is concluded. If you're not planning to make it into a smooth pile, then just making a regular pile. Hakitniyos, legumes become concluded mishayichbar. The moment you finish sifting them. Go back to this picture. However, while you're sifting, you can literally take legumes that are falling under the sifter and eat them, still as snacks. If you're not planning to sift them, until you make a pile nicely out of the legumes. Nevertheless, even though you made a nice pile, before you tithe, you're allowed to take from the unprocessed, that's what kaitim means, the unprocessed legumes or grains, or from the sides, or from whatever is in the straw. In other words, the garbage pile that you've thrown out, even though you find more kernels there, you can take those and eat them before they're actually tithed. Halacha Gedalat Hayayin. When is wine considered to be concluded? The moment you put them into barrels, and you skim off the seeds and the peels and other foam that can gather there from on top of the barrel. That's the beginning of the stage of fermentation, and once you've done that, the wine is considered to be fully processed. But as long as it's within the pit. Remember, we saw this picture before. They would line up the grapes over here, press them, they'd go down into the vat and collect over here. As long as the wine is still in here, when you lift it up to put it into a barrel, at this point, you're still allowed to drink as a snack from the pit. You can also catch some wine from the upper pit, from the pipe that's going through the pits, from any place around the wine press, and drink the wine, because it's not considered fully processed at that point. Halacha tezvav hashemen. Oil is considered processed mishayered la'uka, when it descends into the collection vat. So this is pretty fascinating. I found the website online where you can type into Google oil presses in the Holy Land. They show you different types of oil presses that existed in different time periods. This is probably the one that Rambam is referring to, where it would function like this. In here, in what's called the basin, they would load the olives in baskets or in sacks made of rope. There would be a big stone that would go on top of the olive that acted as the press. And then there would be a wooden lever. There would be a weight over here and would use the weight to press down on this stone. And that would create the beginning pressing of the olives. The oil goes out from here. Not sure you can see clearly on the picture, but there's a little hole here. That's the collection vat. All the oil would collect over there. And after a couple of days, it's really just oil, it's really olive juice, but after a couple of days, the oil would separate from the water and you would have oil. So uka is down here. Uka is the vat at the bottom of the press. So once the oil goes into the vat at the bottom of the press, it's considered to be processed. Afal pisha yardad, but even though the oil already descended, it's still permitted to take oil or juice from the ekel. That's the ekel is the basket where they would put the olives. Umin hamemel. Memel is the stone that's used to grind the olives, this one over here. Omi ben apasin, and from between any of the wooden boards or grinding stones, there was different variations of this press. But if there would be more stones or more pieces of wood, and there's some olives stuck in between the wood, you can take juice that comes out of that. V'noisim likaira ktana, and you can pour it into a small bowl, ulatamchir, a bigger bowl, even inside a cooking dish, afal pishu cham, even though it's hot. What's the novelty there? Because if you cook it, the obligation for tithes is established. Here, you can pour it into even a hot dish, because the dish is considered to be a second utensil. We had this in the laws of Shabbat. When something is cooking on the fire, it's called kli rishon. It's the original utensil in which it was cooked, which saw the fire. You pour from that utensil into another dish, that's called the kli sheni. The kli sheni is not hot enough to cook most things. And therefore, when you pour this oil into a cooked dish, presumably it's a dish not on the fire, it's a secondary dish, and therefore it will not cook the oil, and therefore it will not establish the obligation to be tithed. But if indeed it was super hot, so hot that if you put your hand to it, it would be scalded, don't pour the oil into that, because it'll be cooked, thereby establishing the obligation of tithes. We don't want that. A fig cake. A fig cake, this is how they used to do it in the times of old. Literally press tons of figs together and make it into a cake. Misha yachli kenu. The moment you smooth it down on all sides, that's the concluding stage of its process. Hagregreis, dried figs, misha yadush. When you crush them into the container in which they'll be stored. I got this picture from Merkaz Daf Yomi, Rabbi Eli Stefansky online. I've used multiple of his pictures in the past. He's been kind enough to allow me that. This is a picture that his own artist made. So he takes all the credit. He gets all the credit for that. To basically describe what it looked like to dry figs. Drying figs was a very common practice in those days. They would take their figs. In many cases, they would even cut them in half, as is displayed over here. Other times, they'd leave them whole, and you literally put them into a container, a big container, and put them out in the sun to dry. Once it dried, now it's dried figs, and you can use it for many, many things. So the Rambam is saying, if you're making dried figs, once you stuff them into the container into which they're going to be dried, that's the concluding stage of their process. Says the Rambam, if you put them into one big pile, not a container, just a standing pile, then the time of the concluding process is when you make with your hands kind of a roundish circular shape of the pile on the top. If you were crushing dried figs into a barrel for storage, or you were crushing figs into a cake on top of a larger storage container, and the barrel broke or the pile opened, since you've done the act which concludes the process, even though the process was kind of undone because the barrel broke, the pile opened, but now it's already been established, you can no longer eat it until you take Maaser. Figs and grapes that are out to dry can be eaten as a snack in their place. But if you take them out from the drying area to somewhere else, you can no longer eat as a snack from them because their work has been completed, even if they aren't fully dry. Carobs. Before you take them up to the roof, you can bring them down for the animal and it'll be exempt from Maaser. Because even when you take down for the animal, what the animal's not going to eat, you'll take back to the roof to dry, which means you're only feeding your animal as a snack, you haven't concluded the process yet because you know you're going to take it back to dry, and only then will it be finished. If you gave Maaser to the Levi while the grain was still stalks, you didn't fully process it, you shouldn't have, you gave it early. The Levi cannot eat it as a snack before you take the Trumas Maaser, the tenth that belongs to the Kohen, from it. If he did, he'll get lashes, rabbinic lashes. Now we've been talking so much about eating snacks. What's called eating a snack in halacha? Let's say you were peeling raw barley and eating them, just grain. Peel them one by one. That's called a snack, temporary eating. If you would peel so much and put them into your hands, you now have a handful of grain. That's not called a snack anymore. You have to take a tithe now. If you're doing the same for wheat kernels, you were crushing them in your hands. You can sift it kind of from hand to hand and eat. But if you sift enough into your bosom or into your lap, and now you have a whole collection, you have to take Maaser. Certainly if you sifted with a regular sifter, that's not considered to be eating as a snack. You can also take wine and pour it into a bowl or into a cold dish and eat it, and then it's not into a pot, even if it's cold, because that's like putting it into a small wine storage pit, and that concludes the process, and you don't want to have wine concluding the process, because then it's established for tithes, and you can't eat it till you tithe it. You can squeeze olives onto your flesh if you need an oil type of ointment, but not into your hand, because that's like collecting it. The same thing applies to all similar situations. You have to use your common sense to understand at what point does a snack transfer into a regular full meal. The same way for a human being, it's permitted to eat as a snack produce that that its process has not been concluded. You can also feed to your animals, and to your beasts, and to your birds, whatever you want. You can declare ownerless whatever you want before taking Maaser. But once they finish the work, the process of these produces, even if the circumstances that would establish the obligation for tithes haven't happened yet, no declaring it ownerless, no giving it to your animals on a consistent basis until you take a tithe. If you're giving an animal as a snack, it's both things. It's not an animal food. You're giving an animal just for a temporary time, then you can give it even tevel, even totally untithed produce, even if it's in the middle of your home. You can also feed an animal rolls of straw until you make them into bigger bunches. A person finds ketzitzos. Ketzitzos that Rambam himself defines elsewhere as just regular dried fruits, but typically it's understood as dried figs. Even if it's on the side of an entire field of figs, they're exempt from Maaser, because you found them, they're ownerless. Matzah gregreis, if you found dried figs, if most people have already crushed their dried figs, Most people in the city have already put away their dried figs, chayav la'aser, then they've already concluded the process, and whatever you found is probably from that pile and has to be tithed before you eat it. Because the presumption is that the figs that you found are coming from an object whose processing was concluded. Same thing if you found slices of fig cakes, which means that they came from something whose process was concluded and has to have Maaser taken from it. If somebody finds sheaves are pretty big piles of wheat. If it's in a private domain, chayav la'aser, you have to take Maaser from them before you eat them. If you find them in the public domain, they're exempt, they're ownerless. Alumas are like bales, much bigger bundles of wheat. For certain, everywhere they have to be tithed. If you found grain in a nice pile, you can convert it into truma and maaser to cover other produce that you have elsewhere without worry. If you found a basket of produce covered with leaves, it's obligated to be tithed because the process has been concluded as we went before in this chapter. If you found a simple basket in a place where most produce is taken to the market, you cannot eat it even as a snack. You have to assume it wasn't tithed, but you have to take tithes only as demai, as questionable produce. You're not sure if it needs to be tithed. If most people take their produce in this region, this locale, to their homes, you could eat it as a snack, and you have to take tithes from it as definitely required produce. If it's half-half, some people in the region take to the market, some to the homes, demai, it's questionable. If you bring it into your home, then at this point it's for sure obligated to be tithed, and you must tithe it. Says that Rambam, what are we talking about? If it's an object which doesn't have a specific stage at which point its processing is concluded. But if it's an object which has a stage at which its processing is concluded, even though you're taking Maaser as a definite requirement, Truma won't have to be separated, because we can always assume that people take Truma. We'll see more about this later on in these laws, that even Jews who were suspect not to take Maaser took Truma. Truma everyone stays away from. And therefore, probably when its work was concluded, Truma was taken, Maaser may not have been, and therefore you have to tithe it out of doubt. If there was an ant hole created next to a pile of grain which is obligated in tithes, any grain you find in the hole also has to be tithed. Because it's clear that the ants were dragging from this nearby grain pile whose processing was completed and therefore obligated in tithes. If somebody finds olives under an olive tree, or carobs under a carob tree. This is a carob tree in Israel. Let's go back to the olives, just to show you what that is. You find carobs under a carob tree. Chayavin b'maaser. Those olives are obligated to be tithed. Shecheskasan shemeilan zanaflu. They can be presumed to have fallen from that tree. Matzah te'enim tachas hate'ena. But if you find figs under a fig tree, harehem safek. They're in doubt. Why are they in doubt? When figs fall off a fig tree, they change. They get very dirty in the earth under them. And you won't be able to examine them to know maybe they fell out from this fig tree or from a nearby fig tree which already had tithes taken from it. If a person declared detached produce hektish, dedicated to the temple treasury, and he redeemed them back from the temple treasury before their final stage of processing was concluded, chayav la'aser. Since it was concluded in his own regular person's domain, you have to take Maaser from them. But if the final stage of processing was concluded in the hands of a temple treasury, and then it was redeemed, they're exempt from Maaser. Because the time of obligation, in other words, when the processing was concluded, and at that point the obligation was established, they were exempt from Maaser, because the temple treasury is exempt from Maaser. Similarly, if a person declares standing holy, so that it can be used for the mincha offerings, the flour offerings in the temple, in this moment, you've transferred ownership to the temple treasury, and therefore all your future grain is exempt from Maaser. I find it interesting to note that the last halacha of today's chapter and yesterday's chapter both discussed hektish. In other words, how the major theme of the chapter affects a person who declares something to the temple treasury as a donation.